Welcome to the Architectural History module in Semester 6 for Bachelors of Architecture. Today's lecture is on Indulgences in Stone, Rise of Gothic Cathedral. The Gothic style developed far from the cradles of classical architecture, the Mediterranean centers of Athens, Rome, and Byzantine. It is not a further progression or transfer of these ancient traditions, arising instead from the buildings and forms of Romanesque churches, and it emerged in France, mostly in the Isle de France, around the residence of the French king in Paris. The first flowering of Gothic took place under Abbas Suger in the Benedictine Abbey church of Saint Denis in 1130, the burial place of many French monarchs, and after the middle of the 20th century in the cathedrals of Lyon in Paris. By beginning of the 13th century, Gothic architecture had reached its mature form in cathedrals of Chartres, Bourges, and Ains, attaining perfection in the conversion of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis from 1231. Other countries in Europe gradually began to adopt the body of Gothic forms as a result of the influence from developments in France. The rigidly organized Cistercian order in Burgundy also contributed to the rapid spread of Gothic. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the breakdown of the manorial system of the king and of the religious and secular lords, a system extended and consolidated in the 9th to 11th centuries. The economic and social order altered as the system declined. The continued rapid expansion of the amount of land under cultivation and the rise of urban culture were accompanied by improvements in technology. At the same time, a three-field system of crop rotation developed, which eventually was organized on a village-wide basis. The warmer climate in 12th and 13th century and increase in agricultural production created better supply for the towns, where population had doubled and where the absence of famine and epidemic had enabled division of labor to be introduced and a craft industry to flourish. This was supported, perhaps it would be more accurate to say that made possible, by the consolidation of a money economy, which in turn boosted the growth of trade and crafts. By middle of the 20th century, the fundamental structural change and prosperity brought ever more extensive building projects in conjunction with an increase in the price of labor. This was again fueled, and production of dress-stoned blocks and building components made appearance in the 12th century, and it paved for the geometric tracery designs developed 1200 onwards. Also introduced was a system of buttressing the building frame, and after middle of the 13th century, a type of building crane with pulley system. All these inventions were emerging at the time the great Gothic cathedral and the monastery churches were being built, most notably those of Cistercian order with its centralized organization. The Gothic cathedral clearly differs from a Romanesque cathedral in many ways. The pointed arch replaced the round arch, the main part of the church was optically narrower, and the transept and choir were linked together to form one space instead of two interlinked spaces. The square-based system was overcome by means of rectangular walls. A system of buttressing the building's frame broke up the massiveness of the walls. Space enclosing, light-admitting walls replaced thick walls with slit windows, and a grid of tracery took the place of articulated, graduated, and niched wall surfaces. The external appearance was no longer characterized by smooth masonry, but was broken up through devices such as buttressed piers, flying buttresses, open-work giblets, pinnacles, tabernacles with statues. And finally, the big picture windows admitting colored light embodied truth, for color is only visible through the divine light. The elements in the technical system, such as pointed arch, buttresses, cross-ribbed walls, have been seen in Romanesque architecture ever since architects first tried to place a vault on the basilica. In French Romanesque architecture in particular, many ways of approaching this problem can be seen. Thus, the view is expressed that this entire system is none other than necessary perfection of those attempts, and there is no lack or well-founded technical proof to confirm this view. The new system of Gothic architecture addresses the rigidity of the wall, where it almost entirely disappears, and it is placed there is nothing much membered columns and walls, and that it had brought forth at its most important single features the rib walls, buttresses, and rib structure. The Gothic cathedral is not a manifestation in stone of a particular philosophy, but it is imbued within the same spirit as that found in the philosophy and theology of the period, where it is held that all sciences and arts are directed towards the perfection of man to his happiness. Man should try to strive through wisdom to recreate the integrity of his nature if he is to find his way back to his true fulfillment in the wisdom of God. Wisdom is the highest form of perfection of reason. It is able to recognize the order which exists between things and which is directed towards a goal. Thus, according to St. Thomas, which took his lead from Aristotle, it is the task of the wise to bring about the order. The Gothic cathedral is not only the place in which liturgy is practiced, but it is also itself a part of that liturgy, with each detail having a symbolic or allegorical significance. And such, in a theological interpretation, the cathedral is a construct largely removed from earthly existence, building types which from ancient times to contemporary, that is the medieval church, refer to New Jerusalem. This work, as a result of the activities of the architect and master builder, the building which helps us see the light and feel the beauty of God's kingdom, provides a fitting setting for the soul's rise from material to the immaterial world, a place for spiritual exercises, through geometric and arithmetical methods. Number and geometry are forces of order in this world, and as an indication of perfect divine order of cosmos, whence the divine light comes and it is reflected in the glowing colors. In order to grasp the meaning of medieval church building, it is necessary first to perceive the theological and philosophical background as the totality of all means to gain knowledge of God, of the transcendent divine being. The composition of the cathedral was not left to the initiative of the artist, but was instructed by the church, based on the principles and traditions laid down by theologians in the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Contrary to the popular belief, buildings constructed up to the middle of the 13th century were carried out largely without the aid of any construction drawings. The basis for the whole project was at first just the idea of the type of building and the dimensions as envisaged in the mind of the master builder. The architectural design did not take on its final form until the empirical stage of actual working with the materials during construction of the building. The spatial design and proportions were laid down to an established convention, set out in the form of brief instructions, and contained, for example, in the contracts with master craftsmen for their contribution of the building. Only when the work was underway were individual components etched out as scratch drawings to a scale of 1:1. From the second quarter of the 13th century, projections started to be etched with great care 2 to 3 millimeters deep in stone or plastered wall surfaces or on terraced roofs. A Parisian pattern book written by Villard de Honcourt in 1220 to 1230 contains elevations of the Lady Chapel of Reims Cathedral. The basic form of Gothic cathedral is the same as that commonly used for Christian churches since late antiquity. A basilica divided into 3 aisles with central section raised above the sides. Light enters through the windows in the upper part, the clerestory. From the turn of the millennium in central France, galleries were placed above the vaults of the side aisles, opening up as arcades to the central aisle. In the second half of the 11th century, such galleries started to emerge in Normandy and in England. In around the middle of the 20th century, the structural significance of the gallery walls as a component in the distribution of vault thrust from the central aisle came to be recognized. The master builders in the heartland of Gothic architecture in France started to use galleries over the side aisles and in the choir as well as in triple aisle transept as a key element in construction. The first vaulted central aisles in the central and lower Rhine districts begin to appear from 1150 to 1260. The triple tier of arcade, gallery and clerestory was extended in the middle of the 12th century by adding a triforium between the gallery and the window zone. The resulting 4-tier arrangement of the walls became characteristic of early Gothic, good examples. The ribs of the vault spring from bundles of vaulting shafts which give the impost of the round masonry columns with capitals. This gives an impression that the entire upper structure is detached from the floor. After 1194, with the construction of Chartres Cathedral, the gallery was abandoned, leaving the classic Gothic triple-tiered walls consisting of arcade, triforium and a window zone The idea of the main part of the nave being surrounded by a spatial cell is a fundamental observation. The central part of the choir, the area with the altar and choir stalls, spatially enclosed and given a basilic air by the ambulatory with radiating chapels, continues in equal height crossing of the central nave and four bays of which they belong to the choir. The middle of the church, in other words, the west-east axis with the main altar, lay altar and processional routes, is the core area for liturgical practice, and its ceremonial effect is heightened all along the axis, from the west portal right down to the main part of the nave. The side aisles, like in the transept and the ambulatory of the choir, are peripheral liturgical zones of the main area of the nave and choir. The pierced end of the choir and dominant rose windows at the ends of the transept and in the west wall play a key role in marking out the main axis. These light sources, with their figurical depictions in stained glass, are, in both a spatial and religious sense, determining factors in the limits of this core area. The formal difference between pillar, column, pilaster and vaulting shaft have to be taken very seriously in investigating the form of Gothic support if one has to understand the various stages in development. A pillar, as distinct from a section of a wall, has to have an impost that can be separated from ground by a base or a pedestal. The main shaft of a pillar is made up of masonry blocks which may be rectangular, octagonal, circular or cruciform. A pillar does not taper towards the top. By contrast, a column always has a base, a shaft and a capital, and generally also an impost. As a rule, the shaft is monolithic, but it may also be made of column drums, and it may be circular, octagonal or spiral in shape. Its cross section often tapers towards the neck at the start of the capital. Pillar and columns may take form of projections from a wall, called engaged pillars or columns, and may be combined with each other. If the shaft of an engaged column has a square cross section, or if the engaged pillar has a capital, then it is termed as a pilaster. If the shaft of an engaged column is exaggeratedly long and does not taper, we refer to this component, which generally takes a rib vault, as a vaulting shaft. The vaulting shaft in the early and high Gothic usually has a base and a capital. Roman and Romanesque vaulting consisted entirely in the design of vaulting planes or surfaces without reference to their meeting lines or groins, whereas medieval vaulting consisted in profiling the groins which were erected first and supporting the vaulting surfaces which were made to adapt themselves to them. The problem for the medieval architect was to vault in stone the nave of a church of a basilican type and at the same time to provide for lighting of the building by means of clerestory windows in the nave walls above the aisle roofs. The church was thus crowned with a fire-resisting covering over which a wooden roof was placed in order to protect it from the weather. The evolution of vaulting in England, as on the continent, involved the solution of a group of constructive problems. This was as the connection necessary for counteracting the thrust of the nave walls brought down on the piers that the greater part of the evolution of the constructive side of the style took place. The pointed arch became permanently established, surmounting all the difficulties of difference in span and enabling the walls of varying sizes to intersect without stilting or contrivances. The cells are known as infilling, were quite subordinate to the ribs. They were a clunch or light stone in thin beds resting upon the back of the ribs. They were arched form but often had winding surfaces and were constructed so that their pressure was directed towards the piers and not the wall rib. This was produced by stilting or raising the springing of the wall rib when forming the window arch bordering on a vaulting compartment above that of the diagonal and transverse ribs. This was a common arrangement and was necessary in order to obtain greater height of the clerestory windows. The geometry of the Gothic system was a rough use of mathematical truths. The curvature of the ribs was obtained from the arcs struck from one or more centers and designed without reference to the curvature of the adjoining ones, as seen in the setting out of the Gothic vaulting compartment. In the former, vaulting surface is everywhere level in a direction parallel to the axis of the vault, and any horizontal section of a spandrel or meeting of two cross walls would be rectangular. In the ribbed Gothic vault, however, the plan thus formed would have made angles as ribs, varying according to the curvature of the latter. The plain four-part ribbed vault, primarily constructed as a skeletal frame of diagonal and transverse ribs, was chiefly used in this period. Later in the century, intermediate ribs were introduced between transverse and diagonal ribs as a vaulting of the nave was specifically required to strengthen the vaulting surfaces by decreasing the space between the ribs. In case rib of ridges were introduced in order to take the thrust, which would be at an angle, would have a tendency to fall towards the center of the compartment unless resisted by the ridge rib. Tracery is an important formal design element within the development of Gothic style. The effect variously described as diaphanous quality of the wall, extending form, and grille-like design of the worm, most particularly the introduction of the optical skeletal construction in around 1200 to 1220, were only made possible through the emergence of tracery as a space-defining element within the building frame. For the optical negation of the wall as a solid border to a space left no room for the kind of light-bringing, wall-penetrating windows found in the Romanesque style. It is this form that changed completely in the choir chapels of the cathedral that marks the birth of true Gothic in Reims in 1215 to 1220. Tracery did not replace the lead bars and reinforcement of Romanesque or early Gothic glass windows, but served as a space-defining grille between the elements of the building frame. Thus, a consequence, tracery forms an entity together with the profiled walls and the accompanying colonnettes supporting walls. As blind tracery, it spans wall surfaces, and its profiling corresponds to that common in columns, arches, and ribs. Tracery is built up exclusively of exact circles, and only a pair of compasses and a spirit level were needed to construct it. The wealth of forms found in a tracery is practically inexhaustible, giving a variety of designs that is overwhelming. Each individual form is inextricably linked to the next through its geometric location, through the overlapping arcs of circles, and through the fixed grid of lines. Tracery consists of vertical, profiled bars, that is mullions, which may be decorated with round bars of small slim columns. The bars are of varying thicknesses divided into central and dissecting main bars, and the thinner secondary bars. Above the impost line, the central part of the tracery is made up of circles called the foil and later geometric figures. The leaf of the triskel are enclosed within further circles. The angular shapes at the intersection of the arches, sometimes finished with thickened nosing cups, often trifoliate. The system of buttresses and flying buttresses is an important element in the construction and design of Gothic cathedrals. Together with the transverse arch, cross sprinkles, and vault caps over nave and side aisles, these elements form an indissoluble unit and are key to the stability of the construction. By spanning nave and aisles as a single integrated unit, this base span is quite distinct from the single base of Romanesque groined walls, which were used as simple, regular, repeated spatial element. The Gothic construction system enabled equal height vaulting to be used across spaces of different sizes by inserting pointed arches, with the legs of the arch being inspected at will. The cross-rail vault collects the reaction and shearing forces, mostly via the ribs. The transverse arch and the blind arch brings them together on 4 base points, the bearing points of which on the nave wall have to be very well constructed to take the concentrated forces. The wall between the bearing points therefore takes virtually no load, and it can be hollowed out, thinned down, or completely broken up into tracery windows. As means of strengthening the wall at bearing points, buttresses are inserted vertically in line with distribution of forces and stepped around the hood molding. They project from the wall, and together with the projections of the interior wall, the vaulting shafts, they form a structural unit. The buttresses terminate either in coping, which serves as a dripstone and which may be offset with the eaves molding, or they can be exaggeratedly heightened, almost tower-like, with a saddleback roof, such as on the choir of cathedrals. In order to transfer the vault thrust and the wind pressure on the nave, or on the central part of the choir, to the outer walls with their buttresses, transverse walls were extended over the transverse arch of the side aisle vaulting, which remains invisible under the slanting roof. A flying buttress consists of a self-supporting rising arch above which is a straight bar or a strut. The masonry arch is constructed on a wooden template with the lower end integrated into the buttress and the upper end springing from the corbel or impost projecting from the clear story wall. It receives additional support from a colonnette either engaged in the wall. In case of a double flying buttress, the lower one serves to take the volt thrust, the upper one the wind forces. An important aspect in the flying buttress is the angle of inclination, because a gently sloping strut produces more unfavorable loading on the buttresses than a steeper one. However, the steeper the angle at which the upper strut meets the clerestory wall, the greater is the load required from the roof and roof covering to balance out the upload of the truss. In terms of progress of construction work, this has meant that the roof had to be built before attaching the flying buttresses between the clerestory and the buttress. Both the flying buttresses and the vault had to be added at the same time to avoid one side pressure on the clerestory wall. Constructing the roof before the vault gave the advantage that the roof frame could be used as a working platform for erection of the vault. In Gothic churches, windows become a key element in spatial design, up to the point that windows had served only as openings in the wall to enable light to enter. They had been mere holes varying in size through which light was channeled into space, illuminating and dividing it in different ways. In Gothic architecture, however, the windows derive their effect from the structure of the spatial divide. This divide itself a spatial construct and appearing as a source of light. Although in this progression the windows are behind the sculptural elements of the window tracery, the colored light they transmit give them a spatial appearance, extending the flat plane of the glass into another dimension. The penetration of light into space and the luminosity of the glass windows are immediately noticeable. In course of development towards the wall structure of the High Gothic, the window surfaces became even larger as the structure of the stone walls is broken up. Thus, the significance of windows is not much as a part of the wall, more than they come to dominate the entire surface of the wall. The interaction with the articulated wall diminishes in the same ratio that the glass windows themselves become walls. The extensive glass walls in Gothic cathedral are to be regarded as a link between the sum of new experiences in building and the Neoplatonic and scholastic metaphysics of light. In the scholastic science of being, light as the first and general form also stands the form of the perfect body, since that which is formed by light is viewed as the real beauty, that in which also revealed the good or divine in the theological sense. It is the light that through its power lends beauty and sanctity to the material, and thus also to the architecture of a church. As such, it is easy to understand the tendency to build even larger windows in the house of the Lord, the church, to bring more and more fullness of light and therefore divine light into the building as a presentiment of the heavenly church or the time of redemption. The term stained glass derives from the silver stain that was often applied to the side of the window that would face the outside of the building. When the glass was fired and the silver stain turned a yellow color that could range from lemon to gold. Stained glass was usually used to make windows that light would shine through the painting. Stained glass in Gothic cathedrals were windows were originally meant to go up high in the windows of the cloister, and even through piece itself rather small, this tremendous clarity of line work makes it quite legible from the distance. A point in time where glass panes were too expensive for most people, only in the late 1400s did glass panels become widespread so that the middle class and wealthy people could have them in their homes, and they started setting into their clear glass windows smaller panels that would be amusing or instructive or celebrate their family histories. To produce the stained glass, an artisan would first make sketches or cartoons of the finished window by drawing out a life-size blueprint of window onto the board. Following this creation, the blueprint of the glass is produced by combining sand and potash. Copper oxides were used to produce shades of green or blue-green, cobalt to create a deep blue, and gold could be used to produce wine red or violet colored glass. The development of the rose window derives its inspiration from creation of geometrical circular forms, which were then covered with radiating and final net-like tracery. The rose has been made up of many small foils or towards inserting the foils into pointed arch form, with trefoils and quatrefoils making up majority, and the quatrefoils no longer exclusively in the upright position but also recumbent. The rose window developed out of oculus, a small window found in ancient Roman architecture, but it was during the mid-12th century with the development of Gothic architecture in France that rose windows came into prominence and later spread into many places of Europe, notably Spain and England. During the Gothic period, the emphasis in church architecture was on soaring height and grace sense of light. Taller window-filled churches were made possible by advances in building techniques such as development of tracery, supporting stonework in the forms of bars or ribs between glass sections. Tracery allowed the windows to become larger and more open, and it could also be decorative and elaborate. Every element in Gothic cathedral has a meaning. Same is true for rose windows. Their symbolism lies in geometry and the sense that many parts make a whole. When you study them, you realize that rose windows are made up of geometric shapes, have a specific number of radiating forms, subdivisions of smaller forms, and sometimes more division in the number of arches and other forms. Many factors came together to influence the creation and form of a major building, not only the political and religious position of the person commissioning the work, the resulting organization of the building, but also the experience of the person in charge of construction, the master builder. Above all, its individual forms, particular shape, and the way they are put together have the most effect on overall appearance of a building. The forms are vocabulary, they are blending together the grammar of sentence, and together they result in specific expression. Since the Gothic architecture started to be appreciated, attempts have been made to pick out the individual characteristics form which pay tribute to the significance of the formal appearance of Gothic cathedrals, such as pointed arches, rib walls, buttressing, open gable, pinnacles. The Gothic style of architecture in dressed stone emerged primarily in France and developed in the Isle of France. The limits of the interior space were marked out by walls which had their own spatial depth by the triforum and stained glass between vaulting shafts of clerestory. Tracery, geometrically constructed stonework, made up circular arches which was used to throw a grid across the windows to link in the individual components structurally and to act as an element in spatial design. The relationship of tectonic form and the overall appearance and the special treatment of light was made possible through the introduction of buttressing system, which together with openwork gables, pinnacles, opened up the design for the exterior. On the facade, the higher sections of the buildings grew, as it were, behind lower sections. Several layers made up the principle of intersecting tiers. The visual negation of the structural reality with the loading forces led to an impression of floating and a sense of striving upwards. The visible architecture of the cathedrals is an illusion when one considers the actual technical construction. Geometry and colored light gives an indication of the perfect divine order of the cosmos. Gothic in the new cathedrals is masterly harmony of construction, illusion, rationality, and theological ideas. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.